So this is the video on consonant allophones. As we have seen, for the production of certain plosive sounds, then first there is an obstruction of the air, which is called the stop phase. Then the air behind the lips or behind this obstruction there at the alveolar ridge or the velum then is compressed. Okay, so this is the hold or also compression stage. And finally we have the opening of the articulators that provokes the release of the air. Okay, in English in particular, that release is produced with an explosion because the air that has accumulated is very strong. Well, here we can see some articulatory diagrams for plosive sounds, the one that we have seen in class. So sometimes many phoneticians use these diagrams, as you can see, that by showing, for example, the stop, hold, and release phases, how this is represented, okay, as a diagram. But you can also see there now a GIF image in which there is an animation of the sounds as they're being produced, but you can notice how the air is compressed, released, and held. Well, the two different diagrams here show, for example, the articulator diagrams for plosive sounds that are produced with two active articulators, and the three steps for the production of plosive sounds with one active articulator, the tongue, and a passive articulator, the alveolar ridge. Now there are two videos that I have selected here for you to watch, especially if you want to imitate the articulation of consonants, and these two websites are very useful for that. We're going to start now with the allophones, and the allophones that affect mainly plosive sounds. One of the first allophones that affects the plosive sound is the incomplete unreleased plosives or plosives with no audible release. And this happens when we have two plosive sounds in a particular sequence. So one plosive sound followed by another plosive sound. Here in this different illustrations you can see the possible combinations. So what you should bear in mind is that it is the first plosive sound in this sequence that is affected. How is it affected? Well, the manner of articulation of that plosive consonant is affected because it loses the last stage, which is the release stage, and in many cases the explosion as well there. So and this process happens both word internally, that is in certain words that contain two contiguous plosive sounds, or at word boundary. So we're going to see more examples later on. The diacritic that is used for plosive sounds is this half square diacritic that you can see that is placed on the first plosive, indicating that that plosive sound has lost the release. Now let's see this by means of these co-articulation diagrams for plosive sounds. So this is what happens when you have two plosive sounds and both plosive sounds are produced with active articulators. Remember, that will be the case of p or the case of k. In the case of p, we have, remember, both lips, the upper and lower lip, and in the case of k, we have the back part of the tongue together with the soft palate. So as you can see here, what is going to happen is that the first plosive sound is going to lose the release stage, and the second plosive sound is not going to produce, of course, the first stop phase. Why? Because the air is already being stopped with the first plosive sound then, okay? And the last diagram that you can see shows how these two sounds merge into one sound. Okay, so we have a stop phase, a hold phase, then we keep holding the air and compressing the air, and finally there's the release. So what happens when we have an active articulator and a passive articulator? A very similar process, as you can see there. The horizontal line, remember, represents the alveolar ridge. If you're talking about, the t sound, because the alveolar ridge cannot move, is a passive articulator. And then we have these oblique lines that indicate the process through which the tip of the tongue touches the alveolar ridge and then is released. What happens here is that if we have two contiguous plosive sounds with the same place of articulation, because t and d have the same place of articulation, again the release stage is not produced. Okay, and it is discarded, and then we have one final version of the allophone in which we have a stop and hold phase for the first plosive sound, and then only the hold and release stage for the second plosive sound. So what happens if there is co-articulation between a plosive sound with an active beginning and a passive ending? And that is, for example, the sound p is produced with both lips, but the sound t is produced, as we know, with the alveolar ridge and the tip of the tongue. So what is going to happen is that both lips first are going to stop the passage of the air. There's going to be a hold phase, and at the same time, the tip of the tongue is going to move to the alveolar ridge, and then there will be a release then of the contact between the alveolar ridge and the tip of the tongue. This is the case for combinations like p and t, or for example b and t, then, or b and d, and p and d, then. So the opposite can also occur. What is the opposite? That we can have the plosive sound that with an passive articulator and then an active articulator, where the air is going to be stopped, and then at some point the air is also going to be compressed. But since the next plosive sound has another point of articulation, the back part of the tongue is going to obstruct the passage of the air also, at the velum, and then the release of both articulators is going to produce a release. But remember that the sound that is affected mainly is the first plosive sound, in this case d. Now we're going to watch a video with several examples for this.
When linking identical stop sounds, the stopped portion of the sound is held for an extended period of time and then released. In the phrase pet turtle, the ta is stopped, held for extra time, and then released. This method of stop, hold, release signals the pronunciation of both sounds. These are examples with stops. Pa. Sharp pin. Sharp pin. Damp paper. Damp paper. Ba. Job benefits. Job benefits. Doorknob bells. Doorknob bells. Ta. Hot tea. Hot tea. Pet turtle. Pet turtle. Da. Bad day. Bad day. Sad duck. Sad duck. Ka. Black cat. Black cat. Bookcase. Bookcase. Ga. Big girl, big girl. Blog groups, blog groups. Red eye versus red dye. Now that we know how to pronounce two identical stops, we can say red eye and red dye properly. To say red eye, we use the catenation method, but to say red dye, we need to use the gemination method for stops. That is, we need to stop and hold the first D sound and release it at the second D.
Now let's talk about another possibility of not producing the last stage for plosive sounds, and that happens whenever